Good afternoon, Australia. Thank you all for dialing in. We have a fun-filled hour lined up, and I'm hoping at the end of it you'll have a sense of what I mean by consulting, an idea of what's in the formal program that we offer in class, as well as a little bit of an idea of what it's like to work with me. As Rebecca said, we'll have time for questions after I finish talking, but I'll do the bulk of the talking. I'll give you a little bit of thinking time to have a crack at a couple of exercises. Won't be enough to do it perfectly, which will annoy some of you, but a little bit of participation time just to simulate the real thing. So we're going to talk about data gathering and analysis methods. Certainly the full two-day program gets right down to the nitty-gritty of how to actually gather data and analyze it, and various ways of going about that. It's all slanted towards ICT professionals, but in its essence, it's generic consulting skills. I learned how to do this many, many years ago in IBM. I learned it subsequently again as an academic, so I'm bringing some academic rigor to the whole process of consulting. And part of our challenge today will be just to solve the riddle of, well, what actually is consulting? So I hope to do that in the next half an hour. So we'll look at data and analysis methods, primarily in order for us to be able to isolate and solve business problems. Now, I see from the early registrations, lots of different job roles in the audience, a lot of business analysts, for example, and I've heard a lot of BAs over the years say to me, it's frustrating running requirements workshops when the users come along, but they haven't really fully thought through their issue. And we spend a lot of our time helping them to solve the core problem before we can actually get down to good requirements and definition, before we should get down to detailed design. I've had project managers say to me, I've had a lot of frustrating project kickoffs where a lot of my people ask me questions and I can't answer all the questions because, again, the users hadn't fully thought through and fully briefed me, but here I am already into project management mode. So those kind of situations can be very frustrating. What we're hoping to do with this program, and we have done successfully for over 10 years now, is teach all manner of IT professionals in various roles how to just take a little extra time, pushing back a little on the users, asking them some more questions, gathering some data, and helping them to order their thoughts so that we have a clear understanding of the core problem, what it is they're really trying to do when they ask us to do something, so then we turn around, translate it into requirements, and build great solutions. That should then benefit everybody, benefit us as IT professionals, benefit the core business. So how do we go about that? Well, on the next slide, you can see long before we get into project management, we've got to do detailed solution design. Prior to that, we do traditionally good requirements definition, and we're suggesting in this program, on occasions where the users haven't fully thought through what it is they're trying to do, we might need to spend a little time helping them to identify their core issue, their major challenge, and at least identifying the central problem, if not actually solving it. You know, if you do that well enough as in a pure consulting sense, it might not even turn into a large IT project, but guess what? I bet you've still got lots of others on your slate, so you won't get bored if you do. But it'll certainly save the users from pushing back at user acceptance testing, saying, well, that's not going to work, or that won't do the trick, or we don't want to have any of those situations. So I've got some definitions here of consulting. Different people call it different things. Some people just call consulting because they're effectively external contractors, and consultant sounds better in some spheres. But here are some classical definitions out of the textbooks. For example, the delivery of specialist skills from outside the organization. There's no organization can carry all of the skills they need in terms of full-time headcount. So on occasions, they need to go outside and get subject matter experts. In some cases, as per the second definition, anyone who's faced with a choice, anyone in line management, particularly in the core line of business of your organization, may need some consulting in the sense of someone to bounce ideas off, or someone who's done it before, someone who can guide them, someone who can give them some advice. That may not always be you, but you could at least be a good sounding board. You can at least be a data gatherer and researcher, even if you're not the subject matter expert with all of the answers. And the third definition is particularly relevant because it came from a book written by a guy who worked at McKinsey's. And this basically defines how McKinsey's have for decades successfully gone about their version of consulting. They see themselves as performing objective analysis as in their role as dispassionate outsiders. Now, this is part of our challenge as IT professionals. A lot of our clients in the line of business see us as being sometimes a little too close to what we're doing, maybe a little emotionally wrapped up in what we have designed and built previously. Maybe we can't see the wood for the trees. So occasionally they want to get people from the outside who are supposedly not burdened by this passion. Now, I don't happen to think that passion's all bad, but I follow their rationale. But one of the ways we can push back against that is to demonstrate how we ourselves can indeed be objective rather than be subjective by gathering data and doing true analysis and coming up with well-crafted, well-argued findings and recommendations. That'll all be beneficial. So we don't have time to go through exactly how McKinsey do their work, but we certainly talk about that in the core program. It's the same way IBM go about their work in terms of best practice. So there's a couple of good references for us. So we'll talk a little bit about how we do objective analysis, and that's part of what I want to demonstrate today. There are two predominant approaches to consulting. I'll call them in plain English terms the more industrial. If any of you have done any operations research study, for example, this would be on the left-hand side, the operations research approach, very much the blue-collar manufacturing shop floor kind of environment. It lines up with management theory X, where typically the workers are the workers and the managers are the managers. The managers do all the thinking. We don't bother asking the workers what they think. So in the classic operations research environment, very traditional research environment, we can count the number of widgets going past a workstation and measure productivity. Very easy then to compare workstations and see who's more productive, who's less. Why is that? Do they have more modern equipment? Have they had more training? Are they just smarter? It's very much quantitative, numerical, data-driven, very much top-down in the sense that we define the model, the hypotheses in advance. By hypotheses, I mean cause and effect. Which independent variables will cause a change in the dependent variable that we care about? We model that in advance, then we go and gather data that confirms or denies those hypothesized relationships. And it's very outside in. The researcher is aloof and distant from the people who actually do the work. You might even picture scientists in white lab coats with clipboards in their hands, very much separate from the process of doing the work. Now, pretty much back in the 50s, after World War II, that the whole topic of organization behavior came on the radar. And people were just starting then to say, hey, that purely numerical approach where everyone's just a unit of labor, that may not be good enough to explain human behavior, the complexities of the human brain and the human heart. So this field of study is much more recent and is very different in its approach from the left-hand column. Excuse me. Much more contemporary. It's much more qualitative than quantitative, deals much more in textual data. We'll actually spend more time talking to people rather than just measuring what they do. Very much bottom up. We'll go to the people who do the work. We'll observe them. We'll talk to them. We'll listen to them. And sometimes we have to start with a blank page. Why are things not going as well as they ought to? Where's the problem? We may have to do that from scratch, but in the two-day program, we'll actually teach you how to do that by identifying all the relevant stakeholder groups, finding out someone in his group who'll talk to us, starting to ask them questions, see what they can tell us. Then we can quickly start to compare and contrast. We quickly get on top of the issue from all angles, and we quickly become sometimes the only one who can see the issue from all sides. Makes you hugely valuable, hugely powerful, and as a minimum, we'll just turn you into better BAs, project managers, team leaders, service delivery people, etc. But it'll also make you hugely valuable to the line of business. We allow the data to do the talking. We don't preconceive any hypotheses. We just see what the data starts to tell us, and it's very inside out because we get very close to the people actually performing the work. So a lot of academics and high-level researchers typically come from one of these schools, normally the left-hand side, because it's a lot easier to do. Doesn't take us long. It's easier to analyze numbers than it is to analyze text. It's also easier to sell to middle to senior management in the line of business. The other is harder, but it's much more thorough. The right-hand approach typically gives you much greater buy-in, so you'll know what it's like when you get to user acceptance testing, for example, the difference in users going, great, we've been waiting for this, as opposed to, Well, we weren't involved in the process, so we're not very sure at all that this is going to work in our particular part of the organisation. So there's pros and cons to each of those approaches, but again, in the 2-day program, we look at how to do both, and sometimes the answer is a hybrid approach. And that's important. I'm not just saying one is bad, one is good. They both have their advantages, and sometimes you need to do them both. So we follow a 9-step process, broadly speaking, about engaging with the client or the end users in the line of business, performing the actual gathering and analysing of data, and synthesising solutions or at least recommendations for next steps, and then re-engaging, reporting back, presenting, closing out. And ideally, we do a small piece of this first, and then maybe a larger piece of that as the next step, or we might move now straight to requirements definition or market research. Some consulting books talk a lot about the first couple of steps, how to position yourself as a consultant, how to have an initial meeting, how to propose a consulting engagement. Not enough of them focus on the actual get down and get dirty of gathering data, analysing it, synthesising it, with a view to writing a report and maybe going back and presenting to the IT steering committee, for example, and dealing with some difficult questions or objections. So we'll teach you how to do all of those things. Today I'll give you just a snippet of a couple of those, particularly around the core work of gathering and analysing data. Here's a sample of what you might be able to do in as little time as 4 short weeks, and this is assuming only you individually were involved. That's if you could find a window of 4 weeks in your busy workload, but if it's a sufficiently important issue to the line of business, it may well be that someone should spend 2 to 4 weeks just doing a little bit of homework, a little bit of research before we dive into the traditional resource-intensive elements of our IT work. You might spend a little bit of time, say just one day in week 1, setting up meetings, inviting people to interviews, focus groups, reviewing documents that are readily available, extracting data from dashboards, any quantitative data that's readily available. Weeks 2 and 3, you might go and interview people, conduct focus groups, do observation. Maybe you've got people filling in logs or diaries, so you're capturing quantitative data as well, reviewing some of the documents that weren't readily accessible. But leave time in week 4 to analyse that data, to put together a report and a presentation. So hopefully you can see from this slide, you could get 10 days of really quality work done across 4 weeks elapsed and achieve an enormous amount in terms of identifying the problem, seeing it from every angle, and starting to come up with ideas for solutions. And you'll be better versed at doing that than almost everybody you've spoken to. Now, the longer you've got, of course, the more you can do this, but it could be as little as 2 to 4 weeks. Now, it might even be a handful of days, just a handful of days. How would you go about it? Well, you've got a mixture of quantitative and qualitative data collection methods. If data doesn't exist, quantitative data, you might have to get people to complete diaries and logs. Could be for a week, could be for a month. You might have to construct questionnaires, conduct surveys. By the way, there are 2 kinds of surveys, qualitative and quantitative surveys. You might have to go and search some databases. You might actually have to go and do some homework in industry bodies, for example. So there could be a lot of data around, but it may not all be readily accessible. But there's a lot you can do in the quantitative collection. And in some cases, things like system performance, they're already measuring and reporting themselves through dashboards. So sometimes it's quite easy. Sometimes you've got to engineer it. Qualitative data is harder. You might have to go and review documents. You might have to go and do observation. That is sitting next to people while they do their work. Now that can put people off. So sometimes you want to sit closely and listen to them. Sometimes you want to be far enough away so you don't distract them. There are various things like that to think about. Protocol analysis is talking to an expert in an observational sense, getting them to tell you what they do and why they do it as they're doing it. And you can't do that with less experienced people, but you might do that with the expert, the go-to person. You might conduct focus groups, you might conduct interviews. And some of the things we talk about in the 2-day program are, for example, the difference between a focus group and an interview. Yes, I can cut time by putting 6, 8, 10 people in a room all at one time for a couple of hours and running a focus group, but sometimes I get group speak, sometimes the introverts don't say anything, sometimes I don't get the diversity of thought that I might be hoping for. Interviews, though, will give me much more opportunity to dive down deeper with people on a one-to-one basis, but that means it'll take me longer. So I've got the traditional trade-off there between the quality of my work and my outputs versus the time that it takes and the cost that it takes, even if that's only internal charge outs with funny money. So you've got quite a comprehensive set of tools there once you know how to use all of them and the pros and the cons of each, and sometimes you'll need a combination of several, even in a short engagement as we saw previously. Okay, having gathered some data, you'll then have to do some analysis. Excuse me. I'll give you a little bit of thinking time now. Perhaps, what, Rebecca, 60 seconds? I'll give you 60 seconds thinking time. What do you see in this string of numbers? Righto, 60 seconds. Of course, in real life, I'll give you a little bit longer. Useful, though, just to see off the top of our heads what kind of things people might have come up with. So I doubt many people have actually typed into chat. That's okay. I didn't ask you to formally respond, even if you've just done it in your head. I know a lot of people sometimes are looking for a pattern. Like, so hopefully, hopefully you all saw that the numbers are at least increasing from left to right. But they don't increase by the same amount, do they? That's what some people look for. But at least they've all gone up. They're not all odd, they're not all even, they're not alternately odd, even. And I've given you no context yet. I'll come to that in a second. I've got some more ideas for you on the next slide. And the one on the right is of particular interest to me. I wonder if any of you wondered how that one fitted in with the others, whether it should be there, whether it shouldn't. These are all good questions. So part of what I'm trying to do with this exercise here is to say, hey, even before you know the context of these numbers, you might start to see things just about the numbers themselves. Now, it's easy for me to say, I've been working with numbers for a long time. I love numbers. And certainly the more you work with them, the more you just get comfortable with looking at numbers. So I'll give you some of the answers, and hopefully you all came up with some of these in a very, very short time that I gave you. So the minimum was 35. The maximum was 390. What's the trend? They're all increasing. Hopefully you all got those. Did you have time to calculate the average or the mean, which, by the way, was 78.1? Now, that's hugely skewed by the big one on the end, isn't it? If you took that one out, you'd have a much lower average or mean. Not sure if you all know what the median is. The median is the central number, the one where there's as many to the left as there are to the right, and because there's an even number of numbers in the string, that's either the 40 or the 41 in the middle of the string. So the median can be quite different from the mean. If you've got a perfect normal distribution, that's what we call the bell-shaped curve. Sometimes they're very close together. If you've got a heavily skewed to the left or heavily skewed to the right distribution, then the mean and the median could be very different indeed. Sometimes that's important, sometimes not. So we talked about normal versus skewed. 390. Hopefully some of you thought that just looks silly. Maybe it's not meant to be there. And in the old days, that was usually just typographical error. Someone's handwriting was difficult to read. Someone typed in the data. I'm so old I can remember these days. Sometimes that's where we got our typographical errors. So 390 actually shouldn't be there, because I'll tell you in a second what the context is. If these are all numbers of hours worked in a week, then clearly 390 does not belong, does it? Hopefully that's a relief to some of you. I'm hoping even just a couple of you found the 390 really annoying. Get rid of it. I can make sense of all the others. And clearly, if you get rid of 390, you now get a median of 40, you get a much lower average, etc. It changes everything. So let's talk about all of those numbers, leaving out the 390. People working 35, 36, 38, 38, 40, 41, 44 hours of the 38 or 40-hour weeks, I suspect. People working 58 or 61 hours, what's going on with them? Are they just trying to impress the boss? Do they find the work really interesting? Or are they struggling because they haven't had the training, or they're in the wrong job? It could be a bunch of things, couldn't it? Could be a whole bunch of things. So the numbers don't always tell you what's going on behind the scenes, but at least they can point you in the right directions. You need to go and do some more homework. You need to go and maybe ask some questions and gather some textual data to supplement the numbers. But sometimes we'll want to start. Give us a clue of where to look. I'm not too worried about 35 through to 44, but the 58 and the 61, I've got to worry whether they're equipped to do the job, whether I'm burning them out. There's a whole bunch of things I've got to worry about as their team leader or as the researcher or the consultant. And the 390 was just a typo. If I assume it was meant to be 39, then I might want to include the 39 in the string, or I might just have to leave the 390 out completely. Okay, so there you go. There's a fun day in the world of quantitative analysis. That's some of what some of you might need to do as a researcher on the odd occasion. And a lot of tools around, even Microsoft Excel, just bang the numbers in. You know, you can do a lot of the analysis pretty quickly and do some nice graphical work, but you've got to understand what it is you're actually looking for in terms of the shape of the numbers and then the meaning or the context. Let's move to qualitative data, but much harder, which is why a lot of consultants don't bother with it. Harder to control, harder to design, harder to conduct, takes longer to analyze, more subject to pushback and objections when you put your findings up. However, if numbers give you like a skeleton, the qualitative analysis will help you put the flesh on the skeleton. If the numbers and the where and the when and the how much, the qualitative will tell you the how and the why, what's going on. And particularly when you go back to that chart where we talked about human behavior, you can only do so much suppositioning with the numbers, but eventually you have to go and ask people, why do you do it that way? And how do you feel about your work? How do you feel about this tool we've got you using, this system, this layout we're proposing for the new version, etc.? You'll have to ask them why questions and really find out what they're thinking and feeling. And any of you in change management roles, I noticed a few of those in the enrollments, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It's the qualitative that actually helps us to assess the degree of risk and the degree of difficulty that we might confront in implementing or leading any kind of change. So we're going to help you to do that kind of work as well. So here's a really ugly slide, and yes, if I was teaching presentation skills, I'd give myself a smack on the wrist. This is an awful slide. Thank you, Sean, for your coaching. What I'd like you to do is just take maybe 2 minutes of quality time just reading the second, third, fourth paragraphs and see if you can, at least just with your eyes or maybe jotting on the side if you've got a tablet or even an old parchment that you scratch on, see if you can jot down a couple of the key pieces of interesting information that leap out at you. I'll shut up for 2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes. It never seemed like long enough, does it? Now, this is a tough exercise, and I haven't given you enough time, and I just wanted to give you a feel for it. What I'm trying to teach you is a practical, real-world, slimmed-down version of a purely academic technique, but the beauty of that is we're attempting to replicate the rigor of academic-level research, and you need some of that rigor working in the qualitative space to say, look, I didn't just sit down and chat with a couple of people over a coffee. There's a process that we go through, and there's some structure to it. So if I move over to the next slide, I've tried to highlight here some of the interesting pieces. Hopefully all of you come up with at least some of these. You're tearing the hair out, lowest ever level of job sat, workload increased 10%, at least 10%, sick leave up 4%, increased cross-selling, upselling, leverage audiences, uneconomical, assumed branch managers. See, some of those branch managers couldn't even program their VCR at home at the time. This was a real life case, by the way. I did this piece of research in a large Australian financial institution several years ago. Marketing left it all to retail banking ops. ICT didn't want to know because it was the devices weren't SOE, therefore refused, etc. So it was a mess, I can tell you. And the biggest problem was the branch managers in the retail banks, the princelings, and when a bunch of them are getting sick and complaining, something serious has to happen very, very quickly. But I can tell you, all of these stakeholder groups were not talking to each other, and it was going downhill rapidly. So if the next step was that you've identified these key pieces, let's see if we can put them into some sort of structure that allows us to tell a story. I think one of today's fancy words now is narrative. If you watch Utopia, Kitty Flanagan talks a lot about the narrative. So let's see if we can start to construct a narrative so that we can explain to other people what's going on. Because none of them in their silos could see everybody else's viewpoint, but now you can. So the background, marketing wanted to leverage, captive audience, increase upselling. They decided it was uneconomical to invest in a proper distribution system. The problem is branch managers are tearing their hair out. They don't have the skills. There's no in-branch technical support. ICT wouldn't help, but they're still getting bombarded by calls, especially 9 to 9:30 on Mondays. Marketing will leave it all to retail banking ops. The causes are marketing installed these screens at the branches and made an assumption, which turned out, like a lot of assumptions, to be inaccurate or overly optimistic. And ICT weren't involved and then declined to play a role. The impact is satisfaction's down, workloads increase, sick leaves up, and ICT still had to add a head count, even though they didn't want to be a part of it all. So the solution, gee, if they just looked at a digital content distribution management system up front, about $500,000 in old money, they could have saved all this stress and strain. So in the end, everyone lived happily ever after, once we got all back from sick leave. So that's just an example of how you could just go and identify stakeholder groups, go and talk to each one, get them to talk to you, write down what they say, capture not only their statistics and their proper nouns, but capture also their emotional terms, like stressed out, tearing my hair out, etc. See how it makes the story come alive? The narrative, with words like tearing their hair out, just to give it a little bit of color. This is putting the flesh on the skeleton. It enables you as the consultant now to tell a story, and it makes you very, very powerful. And see how I've logically led up to the obvious answer without telling them right up front what the answer was, the solution. I've got to tell the story and lead up to it. But now no one can argue with me because I've done all the homework. Okay, having done all that, you'd write a little report with a one-page executive summary, a brief background on what was your brief, your scope, what method did you follow, any disclaimers, for example, key information or key people you didn't get access to. Then your findings, which are often negative, and some people don't enjoy that. Then your recommendations, which are normally very positive, including, hey, next steps. And sometimes the next step is a little more homework is required before we go and spend a fortune building the solution. And everything else is in the appendices. Okay. You're now semi-qualified consultants. Congratulations. And thanks for bearing with me while I talked at you for 30 minutes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Greg. So, guys, what we actually do have at DDLS is the Consulting Skills for Results and Strategic Edge 2-day course. And that course is actually going to be running in Sydney on the 28th to the 29th of September. Now, if you're in the other states besides Sydney, please do get in contact with us, and that's the email address there if you actually are interested in attending this course. Now, what we might do now is, Greg, if we can go through a few questions. Let me just take you back to one of the slides that you were discussing previously, and that was the 4 weeks engagement estimate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can we really get results in 4 weeks?
Indeed. Indeed. Do you want me to scroll back?
If you like, we can go through that again.
If you get to do all of these things in your 4 weeks, yes, you can achieve an awful lot. You have to have identified the relevant stakeholder groups. Then you have to say, who would I go and talk to? How many could I interview one-to-one? How many will I focus groups? Sometimes you can only get the manager to talk to you in an interview before they'll allow you access to their team. So sometimes it does take a little elapsed time. But if you could get all of these things that you'd planned actually done in those 2 weeks and allow time still in week 4 to do the analysis, etc., you will have some information from all angles, and you'll be down the path to seeing the whole story more completely than anybody else in their individual silos. You can go a long way, if not the perfect job, in 4 weeks.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Can we ever be as good as an external professional consultant, say from Essential or KPMG?
I think sometimes in IT we suffer a little inferiority complex. Now sometimes these external consultants can look pretty smooth. Maybe they can even afford nicer ties and nicer suits, and sometimes it's just the fact they walk around with their laminated process diagram, and they just look a little more structured and rigorous in the way they go about their work. Some of the things we've covered today, much less in the two-day program, will already enable you to look more structured and rigorous if you were doing this kind of work, so that comparison would not look at such a big gap. The other thing we can do is the more that you do this kind of work, even if it's only short pieces like 2 to 4 weeks, the more you do it, the more you get into the groove, the more you know exactly what you're doing, why you're doing, when it's going well, when you need to double back and do a little more, and that makes you better as you go on. If you do it just occasionally, you probably never get to be quite as good as them because they're doing it all the time. Let's remember one other thing though. Sometimes you need external consultants because they're moving around the marketplace. They've probably seen a bunch of other people in similar situations. So sometimes they're bringing market knowledge, sometimes they're bringing a knowledge of best practice that you may not have because you've been working in the one place for a while. But guess what? You know more about than them. Your own organization. You know people to go and talk to. It could even be people you started on the same day as. You know the jargon, the language of your own company. You know the climate. You know the political landscape. You know all the acronyms. In IT terms, you know which systems are held together with sticky tape and string, and I used to do that as an old programmer myself. So there's a lot that we know internally that we could leverage to make ourselves really good consultants that external people are still having to learn when they come in from the outside. So there's pros and cons. We could be almost as good and sometimes better in those ways.
Well, that gives us a little bit of hope to the audience. Now, in terms of questions, guys, please put them into the chat panel or the question and answer panel, and we'll address them there. But there's another question that I would like to ask you, Greg. So, can we really be rigorous scientifically about, 2 people just chatting?
Yes, and I know it's tempting to poo-poo it. And if you remember that early chart about the industrial operations research versus the organization behavior, it's more subjective. The ops research people, the statisticians, will tend to call the organization behavior stuff not true science. I've seen academics almost come physically to blows, shouting at each other, almost wanting to jumper punch each other, because they each believe that their way is the one true way to do science, to do research. So it's certainly more than just 2 people chatting. You'd have to have a plan. In the 2 days, we talk about constructing an interview guide. What are the 3 topics you're going to try to cover? What are the open neutral questions you're going to use to kick off each topic? How will you keep a marker for yourself as you go through the interview to say, we didn't quite finish that topic, but we jumped onto another topic. I must remember to go back and finish that other one later on. Some of those things can be planned and managed in a quite a structured fashion, which gives you a lot of that rigor. It's not just a chat in the coffee shop. That really is only informal, and you might want to do some of that to relax somebody, but then you still have to go and do the more formal piece with a plan that you can almost measure yourself by. And I often show that plan to the interviewee as well. Here's how I plan to go through our interview. Here are our topics. Here's where we're up to. We got a bit sidetracked here, so we're now 10 minutes left. I need to come back and finish that one. Is that okay? And I can then demonstrate to anyone else who asks and answer the same question. I've had that question a lot. It's tempting to cut the corners and just do the informal. It's more fun, but there is a process and a structure that we'll teach that will head that objection off at the pass.
Great, thank you, Greg. So just let's talk about research a little bit here, okay? Isn't this kind of research the responsibility of the line of the business?
Yes, good question. Though I suspect all IT professionals have had the experience, though, where you'd like to think that, and yet here they are standing in front of you going, drop everything else, this is urgent, and they haven't finished doing this homework themselves, but they're so absorbed with the urgency, that's all they can think about now. So they themselves are trying to rush ahead and cut a corner, not to be unprofessional or nasty, just that all they can focus on is the problem, and I want a solution. Help me absolve this pain. So yes, they should have done more of this homework, and some organizations are better at that. Some individuals in the line of business are better at that. I've worked with some clients where they've actually had a team in the line of business that does exactly this. And if they do, that makes our life in ICT much, much better. But if they don't have a separate standalone problem-solving internal consulting group to do this upstream work, then sometimes it falls to us. And unfortunately, because we're downstream, in my personal experience and in a lot of my client work, that's exactly it. It falls to us to either just shut up and get on with it, or to push back just long enough to do what ought to have been done without telling them they're bad people. They're not bad people. They're just focused on the pain.
Thank you for that, Greg. So I guess, project work is always urgent.
Yeah.
How do we justify taking the time out for research?
Well, sometimes you won't get away with it. Sometimes best you can do is do a little bit of research in parallel with kicking off the project. The way to justify it, though, is to say, if you'll just give me 2 to 4 short weeks, the little piece of work that I do will be like an insurance policy. It says everything we do subsequently, all of the resources we throw into this thing, and of course the investments get exponentially bigger as we get into a project. Every time we make those decisions, we'll be making smarter decisions because we did this little bit of extra work up front. It's just like an insurance policy. To insure against anything going wobbly in the more resource-intensive phases, we take out a little bit of insurance by doing a little bit of work up front. Now, of course, once someone in the line of business knows you and they know you'll achieve something of real value in this brief 2 to 4 weeks, then you have an ally. They understand the concept now. First time round, not everyone will be patient enough because, again, they're very focused on the pain. They're being shouted at in the line of business. But I see it as an insurance policy. And my dad used to sell insurance, so I kind of get it. But I know what it's like. I know what the opposite is like. Just being shouted at and told to get on with it, and you know what you're building will work technically, but you know they're not going to be 100% happy with it. You can see all of this in the future, and yet you're just told to get on with it. So sometimes it's not until you get a little bit older, like me, Rebecca, that you learn to push back a little more in the earlier stages to create a better outcome, and then they'll thank you for it. It's not without its challenges having that discussion. So sometimes it's maybe people at team leader level who may need to have that pushback discussion or sell the notion of the insurance premium. Maybe not all professionals will be able to do that in the early days. But as they do a few of these and get more confident, They can exhibit more of how they would go about it. They can talk about more examples of what they've done, use more internal references to give more comfort to the line of business. It'll all get a lot better. I'm being a little bit optimistic and a little bit idealistic, but that's also the result of painful experience.
That's really good to know, because I'll definitely be using that one at the next meeting. So Greg, in terms of a question from our audience, David asks, does the Consulting Skills for Results and Strategic Edge 2-day course goes further into details on how to develop data collection methods such as surveys, questionnaires, analyst techniques?
Yes. We actually talk about both quantitative and qualitative surveys. We talk about how to construct the questions in the surveys, how to construct the scales. 1 to 7 is good if you're doing a Likert scale, for example. So we talk about that. We talk about academic standards for survey design. We talk about sample sizes, representation of samples. There's a whole lot of those sort of things we talk about. In interviewing and focus groups, we talk about, well, I've just covered interviews. We talk about decide your 3 topics. You might even decide the sequence of the 3 topics. Devise your opening questions for each one. And in focus groups, we talk about what exercises are you going to ask the audience to go through. Is it just sit them down for 2 hours in a semicircle and get them to talk amongst themselves? Are you going to put up some data and get them to comment on the data? There's various ways to go about that. And I've got practical real-life examples that I share with the class when we do that from my own work over the years. Some of the tougher ones that I've had to wrestle with that kind of bring it to life. For a whole day focus group, for example, where we spent a quarter of a day looking at the history of the organization, a quarter of a day looking at the current state, what works, what doesn't, a quarter of a day looking at our ideal future state, how good could it be, and then a quarter of a day talking about how do we get from current state to future state. So we even get down to how do we conduct a brainstorming session, how do you generate ideas, how do you even get people, particularly left-brain people, to move to the right-hand side of their brain so they can get a little bit more creative. What vehicles will you use to capture those ideas out of their heads and get them onto the tablet that the note taker is using, for example. So yeah, we get right down to that nitty-gritty level across all of those kind of research methods.